Hey guys, thanks for coming back. My name is Cybertile, all things chess here with you. It's an exciting day because we are going to put our thing down, flip it, and reverse it, as the cool kids say. We're flipping the board around to see the black perspective, to see how you would play against the isolated pawn. The starting game that I chose for this is I wanted to choose a very rudimentary game, to sort of show the evolution of the thought of how to deal with an isolated pawn has gone throughout history. Just some background. Before 1900, really the only proper move played by strong players was e4. And it was considered that any other move by white was just sort of a weird way to take your opponent into a different part of the game. And even the theory on e4 wasn't terribly well developed outside of certain openings. But the theory on d4, well and truly, was terra incognito up until really Harry Nelson Pillsbury started developing some of his plans. So the game we look at was between Johannes Zukertort and Wilhelm Steinitz. This was part of their first World Championship match. Zukertort was a bit of an evolutionary figure. He did play sort of experimental openings like d4 and knight f3. And then Steinitz's next opponent, which was Mikhail Chigorin, was even more of a step forward in terms of chess thought. But Zukertort was white here, played d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6. So standard Queen's Gambit so far. Knight f3. This was when the Queen's Gambit was played. You did see the Queen's Gambit played some back in the day. Of course, the theory wasn't what it is today or even what it was in the 1920s. The plan with bishop g5, that's the main line nowadays. This really didn't come into vogue until Pillsbury came along at the beginning of the 20th century. In fact, originally bishop g5 was called the Pillsbury attack, just because he had such a humongous impact on the theory of that move. But that wasn't for another 25 years or so. So knight f3 takes. This was sort of the fashion. The idea with the Slav really didn't come along until much longer. It was considered almost blasphemous to move another pawn like this. It was considered only proper to wait to move the c-pawn up to c5. And it took some real chess thinkers to come along and say that moving c6 first had some specific benefits that were worth the occasional loss in tempo. But that was the next step in chess thought forward. So d takes, that's completely fine, of course. e3, c5. So this is how we're getting the isolated pawn position, of course. Bishop takes. CD, this is a bit early. Of course, back then, this was very rudimentary theory, if any theory at all. Modern theory prefers that black plays a6 first and sort of holds the tension. And then there are several moves from here. I don't want to turn this into a primer on the theory of the Queen's Gambit. But c takes, it is a little bit premature. The main reason is that this bishop on c1 is very much sort of locked in, and by taking immediately on d4, you immediately free that bishop. So black could have profited by leaving that bishop entombed a little bit longer, and forcing white to make other moves instead of developing that piece. So cd, ed, g7. So fairly standard isolated queen pawn position. This is a little bit favorable for white because he is ideally placed. The bishop on c4 I do prefer to a bishop on d3, just because in a lot of spots you can play d5 very profitably, and that puts black under a little bit more pressure than otherwise. Queen e2, this isn't a bad way. The standard isolated queen pawn way that we've been looking at has been rook e1, knight c6, and then a move like a3. And I would say white's slightly better here. This is a pretty favorable IQP for white. But queen e2, basically the idea is the rook is going to come to d1. That can threaten to play d5. Breaking through in the center, but otherwise white will just do normal isolated queen pawn things like knight e5, bishop d3, or bishop d3 and queen e4 if the knight on f6 is moved, or e3, bishop draw back to c2, and then the queen to d3. Just the normal queen and bishop battery to attack the king side. So queen e2, in my opinion, not the best, but it's still a perfectly fine move. Knight bd7. So we have seen this so many ways that trying to overprotect the d5 square isn't necessarily correct. Now, it's a good idea because because the bishop's on c4, preventing d5 is a little bit more of a priority. But we've seen in so many positions that having knights on, say, f6 and d5, it makes the pieces superfluous. Like, only one piece can occupy d5 at a time, so having all of them focused on d5 just makes black's pieces more passive than otherwise. Kasparov, he looked at this game in his great predecessor series. His recommendation was knight c6, knight a5, and then b6. And the knight moving to a5 gives black the tempo necessary to activate his light-squared bishop. And I would say white's slightly better, but this is certainly a fight. This is definitely better than the game choice. This allows white to build up without really any cost at all. Bishop b3, knight b6, bishop f4. So this is sort of a sign of the times. This was played in 1886, yeah. This is before really any theory of the isolated pawn had come about. Just a quick aside, Wilhelm Steinitz, he was the first official world champion, and he was the first player to really formalize lots of positional chess rules. Before him, it seemed like these great attacks and these great positions just sort of came out of nowhere. They were willed into being by the romantic inclinations of the player played with the pieces. Steinitz was really the first to come along and formalize a set of principles that chess is a rational game, and it responds to rational laws and rule sets. So if you play in a certain way, you can expect certain results all the time, because chess is a closed system. There's no chance or fortune involved. So Steinitz formalized the idea that the isolated pawn is a weakness. Now, Steinitz's view of that pawn sort of lasted. Tarrasch sort of invaded a bit against that. Of course, he invented the Tarrasch defense. But really, it took a figure like Botvinnik in the 1920s and 30s to formalize white's activity with the isolated pawn. Before Botvinnik, Steinitz's invading against the isolated pawn was sort of what held. So the true proper methods of playing with the isolated pawn weren't really known until Botvinnik came along and formalized his attacking possibilities. So bishop f4, it's a very crude move. It's a sign of how little they knew back then about these positions. Basically, every chess player today stands on the shoulders of geniuses. Steinitz and Zukertort were geniuses, but they just knew so little back then that they were sort of having to trudge their way through the murk with every single position. So bishop f4, just not a strong move. Of course, rook d1. And this is far more appropriate. This is a very nice isolated queen-pawn position for white. He'll just continue with moves like a3, bishop g5, bishop c2, queen d3, just normal isolated queen-pawn attack stuff. And white has a great position. But bishop f4 basically loses all of white's advantage. bd5, bishop g3. It would almost be better just to admit as a mistake and drop back to c1. Bishop g5 is correct, just fighting for the d5 square. Bishop g3 just completely misplaces this piece. It just does not belong in g3. Queen a5, a little bit misplaced with the queen. As usual, I have the PGN notes. I don't want to make the video too long, but there's a better move here. Rook a c1, not the best move. Ideally, you can just take on d5. And then just the normal isolated pawn move, knight e5 to activate that piece. But rook a c1, bishop d7, rook f d8. In this specific position, bishop c6 is a little bit stronger. Black would be thrilled if white took on c6, because then this is an isolated pawn on c6, but it is completely shoring up the d5 square. That is an eternal outpost for black now, and black never has to worry about the d5 break at all. Black can just sort of go about his business developing play somewhere else on the board. But rook f d8, queen f3. So this is another very crude move that showed the level of what they knew about isolated pawns back then. If Botvinnik were playing this position in the 1930s, he absolutely would have played the correct move, which is f4. And this is just a straight battering ram move. This is just threatening to ram the pawn up to f5 to open up lines on the king's side. One example line I gave, bishop b5, c4. And we've transitioned to hanging pawns. But this is a super favorable hanging pawn position for white. He's got several threats. He can play f5, just open up lines on the king's side. He can play d5, just continue with this push through the center. This is a fantastic position for whites. This resource with f4, we looked at in Botvinnik's game against Vidmar, and it really took a figure like Botvinnik to almost invent this move. It wasn't really considered a resource before then. But queen f3, just sort of a crude piece attack move. Bishop e8. If you remember nothing else, this is sort of one of the key resources in this game that I wanted to cover. And Steinitz almost invented this move fully in this position. He was really the first to really play this sort of move. Steinitz was sort of notorious for loving cramped but weakness-free positions. Bishop e8 certainly qualifies as cramped but weakness-free. It looks passive, but look back to this position. What is the bishop doing on e8 that it wasn't doing on d7? Nothing. Moving to e8 is a flat-out improvement because it protects the sensitive pawn on f7. That is the key to this move, is that f7 is a key in a lot of these positions, and that bishop completely shores it up. Also, if black ever needs to play g6 to shut out a mating battery of queen and bishop, the bishop will sort of guard that by x-ray as well. So this bishop on e8 can sort of help shore up black's entire king side. It also stays active. You know, it's still on this e8 to a4 diagonal. It sort of pokes its head out and protects things via the diagonal. This is a very strong positional move, but it looked so counterintuitive back then to make your pieces so passive. The Romantic era was sort of being fought by Steinitz, and that was when people, all they cared about was piece activity and attacking and sacrifice, stuff like that. So if they saw a move like bishop e8, they just wouldn't believe it had any merit to it because it looks so passive, but it is the correct positional move here. So bishop e8, star move. Rook fe1, rook ac8, bishop h4, finally reactivating that piece. That's completely correct. Knight xc3. This isn't necessarily a mistake. I think it's not the best move, but it's a momentous move. It really transforms the position when I'm not sure it's really justified. I think black should just hold serve and play rook c7. In that case, maybe he can double on the c file and create c file pressure, or he could just shift the rook back to c8 if he needs to. This transitioning to hanging pawns, we talked about that a little before, and we'll go into further detail when we get to that pawn structure. But it is closely interlinked with isolated pawns, because you can transition to from an isolated pawn to a hanging pawn at a lot of different moments. So basically, white's pawn on d4 is no longer weakness. It's completely shored up. The weakness now is the c pawn. Typically, you don't want to transition to hanging pawns unless you can immediately achieve a bind, where you can either stop c4 from being played, or you can immediately put the d-pawn under such pressure that c4 can't be played. In this case, neither of those are necessarily true. So we'll see the course of the game, but I'm not sure this was the best choice for black. So black plays queen c7. Queen d3, this really is a clear mistake. Bishop g3 was a superior move. Just taking aim back at the black queen to shoo that piece away. Bishop d6, and then the natural move that any strong player would play nowadays. c4 is key in these positions. When you have hanging pawns, you don't want to allow your opponent to achieve something like d5 or to blockade the c4 square. You want to play c4 and to get those pawns actively pushing down the board. So in this position, queen d3 is a flat-out mistake because Steinitz doesn't take advantage of it. He plays knight d5, but the clear best move is b5. And this immediately achieves that bind on the hanging pawns. In the previous position, these pawns are sort of shoulder to shoulder. They're very strong. They're accumulating a bunch of central space. They're threatening to push on down the board and harass black's pieces. With one simple move, b5, you can play c4, but it would just make we would just get those pawns traded off, and the pawn on d4 would be isolated again. But now that the pawn on c3 doesn't really want to move, now it's an immobile target, and that's when black can start mobilizing to target the c3 pawn. So b5 would be a star move here. Knight d5 just doesn't take advantage of it. So bishop back c7. Better was just to play bishop g3. When you have hanging pawns, just like an isolated pawn, you want to keep pieces on the board. You don't want to go trading off minor pieces needlessly. You need to keep pieces on the board to keep firepower around for a potential kingside attack. But bishop takes, queen takes, and then bishop x d5. This is another move that really shows how much chess has changed in 150 years and how much more we know about chess. No strong player would play this move today. Just wouldn't. This bishop is too important. Any strong player nowadays would play c4 without even really thinking. Just would just blitz it out without even really calculating. If I had to guess, I would guess back, in 1886, there was a phobia about leaving that d4 pawn unprotected. But with modern eyes, we see that d4 really isn't a weakness now at all. The pawn could just steam down the board to d5 and take up more space. But just intuitively, we learn about chess in a different way, and we know so much more that we understand that this bishop on b3 is incredibly important. It's virtually mandatory for any hopes of a kingside attack for white. Without this bishop on the board, white doesn't really have a hope of a successful attack, and black can just sort of build up at his leisure. So yeah, rook x d5, and now this is a very favorable position for black. With hanging pawns or an isolated queen pawn, once 2 or 3 sets of minor pieces have been traded off the board, that's when you can really start to focus down the isolated queen pawn or the hanging pawn. c4 just moves back. Rook e3, this is a mistake. White should just sort of hang tight and try to defend his pawns. He doesn't have the material for a kingside attack anymore. We traded off 3 sets of minor pieces, and black doesn't have any weaknesses. This is almost doomed to fail to begin with. Queen d6, rook d1, f6. So this is another star move. You see this a lot in both isolated pawns and hanging pawns. It's important to time this move well, because the e6 pawn is a weakness here. So if white had a very easy way of focusing pressure on the e6 pawn, this would be completely inappropriate. But it's appropriate here because we have 3 sets of minor pieces off the board, and white doesn't have an easy way to generate pressure against the e6 pawn. So this f6 move is vital for taking away the e5 square from white's knight. It makes white a little bit more passive, and it gives black a better chance of focusing down the hanging pawns. So f6 is a completely star move. It's just important to time it correctly. So rook h3. This offers up a piece for an attack. Steinitz does the correct thing and just ignores it. I give the line in my PGN analysis notes, so have a look at that in the notes for the video. But taking an e5 just leads to perpetual. So I would guess that Steinitz didn't even calculate taking an e5 all that much. He just sort of intuitively grasped that when you have a better position, when the static features of the position favor you, you don't want to complicate. You want to keep things simple and just focus on your static advantages. If you're up against a set of static disadvantages, that's when you want to complicate the game. You want to go in for an attack or sacrifice something to open things up. So Steinitz does exactly the right thing. Knight g4. Queen f4, this is natural. I give a couple other alternative moves, so check those out. But I don't want to make the video too long. But Queen f4 is completely natural. Knight e3, bishop a4. This is a very nice discombobulating move. It hits the rook on d1 and asks it where it wants to go. If it stays in the first rank, then it just drops the d4 pawn. But if it shifts up to d2, then suddenly in a lot of lines, white has back rank troubles, which we see as a feature later on in the position. So excellent little prodding move from Steinitz. Rook f3, this misplaces the rook. There were a lot of random sacrifices in h6 that were keeping black somewhat honest. Without the rook on h3, black can tee off a little bit better. Queen d6, e2. Bishop c6, this is inaccurate, and it lets white play a very natural move, which white didn't take advantage of. There's 2 alternatives here. The first one is sort of representative of how good computer chess has gotten. And I'll fully own the fact that this line that I'm about to show you just came from Stockfish 13, because this is just It's too absurd not to be a computer line. I could have maybe eventually pieced it together after a couple days of work, but Kasparov in his great predecessor's book gives b5, and this is a thematic move for these positions. You want to play this move a lot against the hanging pawns. And he engine checked this line and showed it as favoring black. But now, once we get up to Stockfish 13, we see that the following sequence is just a forced draw. So I will give this without really any commentary. Knight g4, steps out of the pin. g3. Next f6, so we're down a rook, but we have mating threats. And this is where I ended the analysis, but this is completely equal. This thing just sort of happens when a new generation of engines comes along. I mean, computers and computer chess has completely revolutionized analysis and how we look at chess. Certain moves that we thought were fine before, we see as complete rubbish now, and vice versa. We see that certain openings that we thought were just complete bullcrap are actually viable because of the crazy computer lines. So that's the first alternative. That sort of invalidates Kasparov's choice in his great predecessor series, but he was using, I think that first book came out 2005 or so. So that would have been a lower generation engine. F5 is the move that should have been played, and this is another thematic move against these hanging pawn structures. With one pawn move, black shuts out all of white's attacking force from his king side. So now the rook, the knight, and the queen have no access to his king side at all. And he's even threatening to push on with f4 in certain positions. So the main line I gave in my analysis was queen b1, f4, pawn on c4 hangs, bishop b8, and that defends the g6 square from random penetration and random perpetuals. Black's up a pawn with a continuing assault against white's weaknesses. So this is a completely winning position for white. So just an interesting little aside. It's amazing to see how far computers have come. I'm going to be 37 in July. I remember when I was 12, computers were just little amusing things that you... Like, I had a battery-operated Chessmaster thing that could play up to about 2300. But now, if you try to play a computer on its max setting, you're more or less wasting its time, because it'll just demolish you without even breathing hard. But just an aside. Bishop c6. This is a mistake. f5 is the best move. Rook g3. This is missing a modern move that most of us would play without thinking. d5 is clearly the best move. When you have hanging pawns, you want to get them moving. You don't want to let them stay a static feature of the position. When you can push a pawn like this, you push it. So just a brief line that I gave, rook c7. And this is more or less mutually assured destruction for each side. Neither side can really try anything in this position. This should be a complete deadlock. And it just sort of showcases, again, how much more we know about chess nowadays. Zukertort might have saw d5 as just a continuing weakness, whereas now we see d5 as potentially getting a strong passed pawn and being very strong. So rook g3, just a complete error. f5. So this is still very thematic. It threatens f4, of course. This is decisive. Rook g6, this is trying too much. The best line is still the pressing. I'll just give this really quick. And black, this is a long, more or less forced line after c5. Black is most certainly better. He's up a pawn, but he still has a lot of work to do. This is not a gimme for black. White still has some decent counterplay against a few of the weaknesses on black's king side. But rook g6 is just completely losing. King h7, just tucking the king away. I give one other line, f4. It's not too late to give away the win, but king h7 guards against that. Rook c5 because of the pin. Rook c1, so that takes advantage of the back rank issues. Queen f4. And this is more or less the position that you're looking for against an isolated pawn or hanging pawn position. All of white's weaknesses remain. Black's position is incredibly active, and the isolated pawn really hasn't generated any counterplay. So the rest is easy. I'll just give the rest of the moves fairly quickly. Rook c8. Of course, if the queen takes, you just take back, and the back rank is falling. And here's Zukertort resigned, and this is completely justified. The queen's attacked, the back rank is falling, this is just completely busted. So, when you look at this game from modern eyes, you get a little bit of a chuckle at times, because they just didn't know a whole lot about how to deal with isolated pawns. Like, even knight bd7, I mean, that is a modern mistake that people still make, but some other moves like bishop f4, bishop g3, queen a5, decent Rono. These are just moves that with a modern eyes we see as positional errors, like they don't penetrate to the essence of the position. So I wanted to give this game first, and our examination of how to play against isolated pawns is sort of a primer of what two very good players for their time, how poorly they played in a position like this. But so next video, either tomorrow or Thursday, we'll continue on with more refined methods of how to play against the isolated pawn. We'll look at how appropriate it is to control the d5 square and how many pieces you should have fighting for it. So my name is Cybertel, also John. I will see you then.